After 12 years of steering my father's company, I finally brought it to a valuation of $75 million. At a family dinner, my dad turned to me, a smile on his face, and declared that my brother would take over now. My heart sank, yet I managed to return his smile. The following morning at work, everything shifted. I can still picture my father's smile that night, his hand resting proudly on my brother's shoulder, as if he had made his decision long before uttering the words that would alter everything. "Your brother will take over now." I felt my stomach drop, but years of practice kept my expression steady. With a composed smile, I returned his gaze, masking the way his words pierced through me, unraveling 12 years of my life's work in an instant. The dining room buzzed with the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of conversations among extended family and close business associates. This was more than a family dinner. It was a celebration, a moment to honor all that we had built, all that I had built. My father had founded Harper & Company when I was just a child, a modest logistics business that barely stayed afloat in its early years. I grew up watching him struggle to keep it alive, working late nights, sacrificing family vacations, always chasing one more contract to make ends meet. When I was 24, fresh out of business school, he finally let me step in, though I had to fight for that opportunity. I had done more than just step in. I had transformed Harper & Company from a struggling regional logistics firm into a national powerhouse, expanding operations and securing million-dollar contracts. Contracts integrating cutting-edge technology. What was once a small, nearly bankrupt company now stood as an industry leader worth $75 million. Yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. My father had already decided my brother Christopher would be taking over, not me. A slow ripple of approval spread around the table, murmurs of congratulations directed at Christopher. I watched as he lowered his gaze, feigning modesty, though I knew better. Christopher had never been truly invested in the business. He had spent the last decade hopping from one failed venture to another. He never quite found his footing. Logistics and operations held no allure for him. His true interest lay in power. I had dedicated 12 years to proving myself, building Harper & Company from the ground up, making every hard decision, enduring every late-night strategy call, navigating each contract negotiation. Christopher had done none of it, and yet here we were. I swallowed my emotions, having learned long ago that in this family, showing pain was a sign of weakness. I reached for my wine glass, steadying my resolve. Hand before lifting it, "Smile, Andre," smiled to Christopher. I said, my voice smooth, controlled. The guests raised their glasses, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my eyes. My mother cast me a glance from across the table, an unreadable expression, but I knew she understood. Unlike my father, she had always seen the effort I put in, but she wouldn't interfere. She never did. Then there was my father, grinning with that same unwavering confidence, completely unaware that his choice had set something in motion. Christopher met my gaze from across the room. At the table, a smirk barely concealed at the corner of his lips marked the moment I realized this was not merely my father's decision. Christopher had been biding his time, meticulously crafting the image of the devoted son who had at last discovered his purpose. My father, ever the traditionalist, perceived no flaw in this reasoning. A son was destined to inherit the empire, while a daughter's contributions were often deemed fleeting, a mere footnote in the annals of history, regardless of her relentless struggle to demonstrate otherwise. But what? They failed to grasp what neither of them had anticipated. I had dedicated 12 years not merely to building a company but to solidifying my place within it. Tomorrow morning they would discover precisely what that entailed. That night sleep eluded me as my mind replayed every sacrifice made for Harper & Company. The late nights, the birthdays missed, the relationships that fractured beneath the burden of my ambition. I had poured everything into this company, and now they expected me to simply step aside. They had gravely underestimated me. By the hour of 3 in the morning, in my home office, my fingers danced swiftly over the keyboard, navigating through every contract, every share, every executive agreement. I understood the intricate dynamics of this company more intimately than anyone else. Christopher believed he was stepping into a seamless transition, convinced that by next week, his name would adorn the office door, his position firmly established. What he remained oblivious to was that while my father engaged in public appearances and my brother feigned interest in the business, I had been quietly fortifying my own position, significantly greater authority at precisely 8:45 a.m. I entered the Harper & Company headquarters, a place I had frequented for the past 12 years. The familiar walls, the gleaming floors, and the steady hum of productivity surrounded me as employees immersed themselves in their daily tasks. Yet today felt distinct. I was not merely heading to my office but stepping onto a battlefield. The reception area was eerily silent, the kind of stillness that foreshadows an impending storm. They were aware. The whispers had already begun, the news of my father's announcement at dinner spreading like wildfire. Employees cast hesitant glances in my direction, their eyes skirting away, uncertain of where their loyalties should rest. I chose not to acknowledge them, striding forward with confidence, the sharp click of my heels echoing against the marble floors. My posture remained unwavering. Never let them see you shaken. I entered my office, closing the door firmly behind me. I had exactly 15 minutes before my father and Christopher would arrive, ready to assume their new roles as CEO and heir apparent. In just 15 minutes, everything they had meticulously planned would begin to unravel before them. I took a seat. Seated at my desk, I took a deep breath before powering on my computer. The screen flickered to life, revealing a collection of confidential documents and contracts, files they had overlooked, believing them to be inconsequential. I accessed my ownership records, my fingers poised above the keyboard for a moment before selecting the file titled Executive Shareholders Agreement. Then I waited, the clock striking precisely 9 a.m. There was a sharp knock at my door. I didn't bother responding. The door swung open, and in walked my father and Christopher, both exuding an unmistakable presence. Confidence radiated from Christopher, a product of careful cultivation, as my father stood like a monarch surveying his realm. Dressed in an expensive navy suit, Christopher offered me a smug, triumphant grin that nearly made me laugh. "Andre," my father intoned in his usual authoritative manner, as if bestowing a favor by simply acknowledging my presence. "I assume you're aware of the transition happening today." "Transition?" I echoed, intrigued by his choice of words. "I'm aware," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. My gaze flicked to Christopher, whose smirk only deepened. "Widened good," my father continued, nodding as if we were all in agreement. "Christopher will be stepping in as the new CEO, and I will need you to help with the handover, getting him familiar with the operations before you officially move on." I arched an eyebrow. "Move on?" I echoed, feigning confusion. "Dad, I think you're mistaken about something." His face twitched in irritation. He was used to my compliance, my ability to quietly fall in line. He wasn't prepared for this. "Andre," he said, voice tight as if speaking to a child, "this isn't up for debate. We've already." I made the decision, smiling a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I know, Dad," I said softly. "The thing is, you don't have the authority to make that decision." Christopher let out a low scoff, shaking his head. "Andre, don't make this difficult. We're trying to do this the easy way." I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for the remote control and pressed a button. The large screen on my office wall lit up with a document, the same one I had been reviewing earlier. The Executive Shareholders Agreement, signed August 17, 2015, signatories Andre Harper and James Harper, father Christopher Harper. My father's face paled slightly. I turned to Christopher. "Do you even know what this document is?" He crossed his arms, shifting in discomfort. "A shareholders' agreement," he guessed. I nodded. "Yes, and do you know what it says?" I tapped the screen, highlighting a crucial clause. This document was drafted when Harper & Company was restructuring. It clearly states that any transfer of executive power, such as appointing a new CEO, requires the approval of all majority shareholders. I met my father's eyes, and I held 60% of the company's shares. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's expression hardened. "That's impossible," Christopher muttered, stepping forward to examine the document. "Actually, it's very possible," I said smoothly. "You see, over the years, while you were busy failing at every startup you touched and Dad was busy playing the role of business patriarch, I was doing something else." I leaned forward. I was securing my place. I turned back to my father. "Remember when you needed capital for expansion? In 2017, You entrusted me with an additional 15% of your shares in return for my investment. Then, in 2019, during our legal battle, another 10% was transferred to my name as collateral, which you never attempted to reclaim. Adding that to my original 35% solidifies my position as the majority shareholder. My father's jaw tightened, while Christopher was visibly distressed. You have to be BL, he exclaimed. I produced a second document. This was the latest legal filing with the state. Christopher seized the paper and quickly scanned it. The color drained from his face with each passing second. You can't do this, he stammered. Dad, tell her she can't do this. My father remained silent, fully aware that I had legally outmaneuvered him, leaving him powerless. I exhaled slowly, rising to my feet. I'm not firing you, Christopher, I stated firmly. I wouldn't want to push you into the real job market, but you will report to me and work under my leadership. Otherwise, I gestured toward the door. You're free to leave. Christopher turned to my father, his eyes pleading, but for the first time in his life, he seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Life had shifted, and my father found himself without answers, powerless to mend what was broken, for this was no longer his domain. It was mine. The silence enveloping my office was stifling. Christopher held the legal document tightly, his knuckles pale from the strain. Beside him, my father stood like a statue, his face a mask of inscrutability. Yet, I understood him well enough. He was calculating, searching for an escape that simply did not exist. I had dedicated years to preparing for this moment, not out of a belief in betrayal, but because experience had taught me to be vigilant, to assume loyalty where power was involved. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me as if he didn't recognize me. Perhaps he never had. So that's it. Christopher finally spoke, his voice laced with bitterness. You're just taking everything. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. Taking everything? I repeated, stepping closer to him. Christopher, I built this company from nothing. Every contract, every expansion, every innovation, I made it happen. While you were busy failing upwards, I was keeping this company alive. So no, I'm not taking. As I leaned in slightly, I was resolute in safeguarding what was rightfully mine. Christopher's face contorted with anger, yet he found himself without a retort. He understood the truth of my words, and even more damning, so did my father. For years, he had clung to the belief that bloodline held greater weight than skill, that his son would inherit what belonged to me. He had gravely underestimated my resolve, and now he was facing the consequences of that error. Finally, my father shattered the silence, his voice calm and measured, though I could sense the strain beneath it. You're making a mistake, Andre, he said, as if trying to remind me of the bonds of family. Stick together. Do you truly wish to burn this bridge? I met his gaze head-on. Dad, I said slowly, you burned this bridge the moment you made your decision without me. His lips pressed into a thin line. Business is bigger than just one person. We can find a solution that works for everyone. I tilted my head slightly, feigning consideration. Oh, I agree. That's why I'm offering you both a choice. I turned to Christopher first. You can stay in the company, I said, keeping my voice smooth and professional, but you won't be CEO. Assume an advisory role with restricted authority. Your compensation will be substantial, yet you will report to me. Christopher tensed, but I pressed on. You have the option to walk away. I'll purchase your shares at market value. You can take the funds and pursue a new venture that excites you. My father scoffed, dismissing my stance as if I were bluffing. I smiled knowingly. I do. A heavy silence enveloped the room, allowing my words to linger, letting them experience the weight of their own helplessness. At last, my father exhaled, shaking his head as if grappling with the reality of the situation. Disbelief washed over me as he muttered, I never thought you'd do this, not to your own family. His words struck like a sharp pang, echoing in the silence between us. I longed to remind him that it was he who had made this choice, who had pushed me aside and treated me as if I were merely temporary. But I held my tongue. In the grand scheme, it was irrelevant. What truly mattered was my resolve to protect what I had built, now and forever. Christopher stormed out first, and I couldn't help but think, good riddance. I knew my brother well enough to anticipate his next move. He would. We visited our relatives, our family friends. while he portrayed himself as the victim of corporate betrayal. Their approval was irrelevant to me. My focus was on securing my future. My father hesitated for a moment, as if hoping I would reconsider. When I didn't, he nodded slowly. "You've changed," he remarked softly. I held his gaze and replied, "No, Dad. I just finally stopped pretending." With that, he departed. I let out a breath, sinking back into my chair. I should have felt victorious. I had fought for my place and emerged triumphant. Yet, as I gazed at in the empty doorway, I sensed something deeper. A quiet, lingering ache. A part of me had always yearned for my father's approval. A small, desperate part believed that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself time and again, he would finally notice me. But the truth was, he had never truly looked. And now, he had no choice but to see me for who I really was. Not his daughter, not a temporary stand-in, but the true leader of Harper & Company. I turned back to my computer, my focus shifting. I had spent, after 12 years of painstakingly constructing this company, I now find myself poised to spend the next 12 years making it untouchable. My father and brother had attempted to strip everything away from me, yet in the end, they were the ones left with nothing. For the first time in over a decade, my office felt eerily empty. No phone calls from my father, no passive-aggressive emails from Christopher, just an unsettling silence. But that silence was not synonymous with peace. It signaled the onset of a battle. I was acutely aware that my father would not retreat quietly, and Christopher would fight with every ounce of determination to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his birthright. I wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end. It had merely begun. By the next morning, I could already sense the undercurrent of unease among the company employees who had greeted me with confidence just a week prior. Now they appeared hesitant, as if fearful of choosing a side. A few department heads deliberately avoided eye contact. I understood what was unfolding. My father and Christopher were manipulating the Whisper network. Old family friends, board members, senior executives, they were sowing seeds of doubt, portraying me as cold, ruthless, and disloyal. Christopher, in particular, had embraced this role with fervor. Of the wounded son, betrayed by his own sister, I envision him now, seated in a lavish restaurant, feigning sorrow as he recounts to our investors how I had snatched the company from beneath him and my father. He wouldn't need to articulate much. A heavy sigh, a shaking head, and the meticulously chosen words, "I only ever wanted the best for my children." It was a calculated and perilous maneuver, for if they succeeded in swaying my board members and top executives against me, they could very well oust me from my own company. At the very least, I would not allow my leadership to be undermined. That afternoon, I convened an emergency executive meeting. As I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Half the attendees averted their eyes, while the other half scrutinized me, eager for a misstep. I settled into my position at the head of the table, resolute. "Let's not waste time," I declared, my voice steady. I was acutely aware of the whispered conversations that had taken place behind closed doors, over drinks in hushed tones. I let my gaze sweep across the room, pausing on each individual for just a moment, long enough to make them shift uncomfortably. I sensed the unease in the room, a few faces tensed, yet silence reigned. I tapped my fingers against the polished wood table, a deliberate gesture to command attention. "Let's clear that up now," I said, pulling up a presentation on the screen behind me. Numbers, data, facts. Each slide a testament to our journey. I transformed this company from a struggling regional business into a $75 million industry leader over the last 5 years. Under my leadership, we've achieved a remarkable 300% increase in revenue and expanded into 6 new markets. I turned to the CFO, Lincoln. "Do we have any financial indicators suggesting this company is in trouble under my leadership?" Lincoln hesitated, then shook his head. "In fact, projections show another 20% growth in the next quarter." I nodded. "So let's be honest about what's happening here." I leaned forward. "My father and brother aren't upset because the company is struggling. They aren't upset because I'm failing as a leader. They're upset because they expected me to step aside and let Christopher take over regardless of qualifications. In the midst of the results, the atmosphere was tense. Then I dropped the real bombshell. I revealed that some among us had been contacted in the past 24 hours, offered incentives to advocate for my resignation. I tilted my head slightly, inviting anyone to disclose those conversations now. A few individuals shifted uncomfortably, and after a long pause, one of the senior executives cleared his throat. "I received a call," he admitted, "from your father. He mentioned he was considering making an official appeal to the board." I nodded in response. Unfazed, I asked if he offered anything in return for your support. A pause followed, then a slow nod. There it was. I exhaled, rising to my feet. "My father built this company," I stated firmly. "I won't discredit that, but I've taken it further than he ever could, and I refuse to let him manipulate it from the outside." I lowered my voice slightly, a controlled danger lacing my words. "If he wants a fight, he'll get one." I gathered my papers, locking eyes with each executive. If anyone here believes my father and brother deserve control, now is the time to speak up. In the stillness, no one dared to stir. Satisfied, I turned and strode out, my head held high. This was more than just a fight for my company. It was a declaration that they would never again think they could seize it from me. That night, I made a decisive call. Not to a board member, nor to an investor, but to the media. By morning, the business sections of every major news outlet blared the same headline. Powers shift at Harper & Co. Andre Harper outmaneuvers family in boardroom battle. I had made my move. Now it was their turn, and I was ready, watching closely. On the morning following the release of my story, my inbox was inundated with emails, missed calls, and messages from journalists, investors, and board members. Some expressed support, others approached with caution, yet the majority shared a singular inquiry. Is it true? I chose to let them linger in uncertainty. I understood the strategy my father was employing. He had dedicated years to mastering the nuances of public perception. He recognized the significance of reputation in the business realm. If he couldn't best me in the boardroom, he would seek to undermine me in the public sphere. And that was precisely his intention. I was attempting to meet a deadline by noon when the first counterattack came in. A press release meticulously crafted and carefully worded, yet brimming with falsehoods. Harper & Company has always prided itself on being a family-run business. We are disheartened by recent events but remain steadfast in our commitment to the values that have shaped this company. Changes in leadership are a natural part of growth, and we aspire to navigate this transition with grace as we forge ahead. It was subtle, but I understood its true implications. Andre is reckless, Andre is unstable, Andre is not a team player. I wasn't surprised, however, I was furious. I sat in my office, eyes glued to the news as industry analysts engaged in heated debate about my leadership. Was Andre Harper too aggressive in her takeover? Would her lack of cooperation ultimately harm the company? Could she bounce back from this PR disaster? They spoke as if I wasn't there, as if I wasn't already plotting my next move. If my father and Christopher were seeking a public war, I was ready to oblige. I didn't issue a statement or call a press conference. Instead, I reached out to an old friend in investigative journalism. "Something for you," I said, "but you'll need to act quickly." An hour later, I dispatched a flurry of documents, emails, financial reports, internal records, evidence that Harper & Company, under my father's stewardship, had partaken in dubious business practices over the years. Practices I had dedicated the last decade to quietly rectifying. Within 24 hours, the story erupted behind the scenes at Harper & Company, revealing a legacy of concealed debts and financial deceptions. The article was merciless, lauding my leadership for restoring the company's financial integrity, criticized my father's mismanagement from the past, and most importantly, it proved that I was the sole reason Harper & Company had survived. Just like that, the narrative shifted. The board ceased their doubts, the investors stopped hesitating, and my father found himself with nowhere to hide. 2 days later, my father finally called. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. "Andre," he said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, a silence hanging in the air, then finally a sigh. "You didn't have to do that." I let out a, he chuckled softly, a sound that felt out of place. "Neither did you. This company was meant to be a legacy," he said. "For the family, for both of you." A familiar pang struck me. A small, foolish part of me had once yearned for that too, but those days were behind me. "Dad," I replied quietly, "if you wanted me to protect the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you tried to take it from me." A long silence enveloped us, and then he asked, almost with reluctance, "What happens now?" I exhaled slowly. Now? Now I ensure they can never touch my company again. The war is over. My father has lost. Christopher had disappeared, and I had won. Yet, as I sat in my office gazing out over the city skyline, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just emptiness. I had dedicated 12 years to Harper & Company, building it, protecting it, making it stronger than ever before. Yet, the cost of that victory weighed heavier than I had anticipated. While I had secured my position, I had lost something else along the way, my family. The next day, I walked into the office as if nothing had changed, but everyone knew the truth. The whispers had stopped, doubt had faded. I was no longer merely Andre Harper, the CEO. I had transformed into Andre Harper, the woman who had outmaneuvered her father and brother, emerging victorious. Some respected me for it, others feared me, and a few still anticipated my downfall. I allowed them to wait. At noon, my father and I convened in the conference room for what would be our final discussion. He appeared weary, older, as if the burden of recent events had finally taken its toll on him. I held my silence, waiting for him to speak first. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I'm retiring," he said simply, effective immediately. I didn't react. I had expected this. "I'll sell my remaining shares," he continued. "I'll keep a small percentage as an investor, but I won't be involved anymore." I studied him carefully, and Christopher, his jaw tightened. "He's gone," my father admitted. "Took the buyout. He won't be back." A part of me had known it would end this way. Christopher had never been strong enough to fight his own battles. Once it was clear he had lost, he had done what was expected. He always did run. Yet, hearing it out loud stirred something within me. Neither regret nor guilt, but rather the weight of finality. I nodded, understanding. My father exhaled, rubbing his temple as if a headache plagued him. After a long pause, he uttered words I never anticipated. "I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest I would ever receive. Strangely, I realized I no longer needed it. A month later, Harper & Company bore no resemblance to its former self. The old board members who had aligned, with my father and Christopher gone, the executives who had once questioned my leadership were replaced. The company, which had always thrived under my guidance, was now truly mine. With that control came a fresh vision. I introduced initiatives my father had always dismissed, modernized systems he deemed unnecessary, and ventured into industries he had been too cautious to explore. Within 6 months, profits soared, and within a year, we crossed the $100 million mark. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Just striving to validate my existence, I was determined to create something that could never be taken from me again. A year after everything had transpired, I found myself sitting across from my father for dinner. It was our first conversation since his retirement, and he appeared changed, quieter, devoid of anger, simply accepting. "I read about the latest deal you closed," he remarked, sipping his drink. "It was a smart move." I allowed a slight smirk to escape, and I noticed a faint smile flicker across his lips. The tension that once defined our relationship had dissipated. There was no longer a battle to be fought, only the simplicity of our shared moment. An undeniable truth. He had attempted to cast me aside, yet I had proven him wrong. He raised his glass to Harper & Company, and when I clinked my glass against his, I felt neither anger nor resentment, only a profound sense of peace. I had already triumphed, and his approval was no longer necessary for me to recognize that. As I sit in my office today, overlooking the city where I built my empire, I reflect on the lessons this journey has imparted. That family can sometimes be your greatest adversary, that loyalty is a currency rather than a guarantee, and that power it is never given, it is taken. Yet, the most crucial lesson is that often the best way to demonstrate your value is to cease the pursuit of validation, and instead create something so formidable that it cannot be overlooked again. I harbor no regrets. Harper & Comp is now under my stewardship, and I am resolute in ensuring that it remains unforgettable.